Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 66th ever Highlight Haven interview. My name is Matthew Heiserman, and today we are joined by the Washington Commanders reporter for The Athletic, Ben Standig. Ben, it's great to have you on.
Matthew, thanks for having me on, man. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. I can't thank you enough for coming on. And getting right into it, I just want to start by asking when you first knew that you wanted to work in the sports industry to begin with.
Oh wow. Well, sports is definitely what lit me up as a kid. Like once I discovered it, like all the kind of everything: football, basketball, baseball, college hockey, whatever it was. Um, what not only watching, but I would do like whether I was playing some video game or I had like this little hoop in my room. I would like
Mhm.
do play by play and
Yeah.
like keep
Mhm.
stats and do that whole thing. And honestly, like nothing has ever got me got the juices flowing to that, from a work perspective, other than
Mhm.
sports. And when I was doing some real jobs, like, I had some other, I was working in the finance world and the mortgage world for a little bit. It never did much for me. And when an opportunity came in to write, I decided, well, if this is the closest I can get to being involved in sports,
Mhm.
I'm gonna do it. So it's kind of been there, I guess, to some degree my whole life. Maybe not necessarily the writing, but being somehow attached to sports is, you can ask my friends and family that have known me forever. They all pretty much like,
Mhm.
yeah, this is kind of destined.
Yeah, absolutely. And getting into some Commanders discussion, specifically the NFL draft, with the Commanders' first round pick in the draft, they selected Oregon offensive tackle Josh Connerly Jr. However, the Commanders obviously acquired Laramie Tunsil just over a month ago and still have Andrew Wiley and Brandon Coleman to account for. Considering that Sam Cosmi's injury will leave the right guard position up for grabs, what's the most likely fit for Connerly on Washington's depth chart this upcoming season?
I mean, generally speaking, you're not going to draft a first round tackle to move him somewhere else unless it was like, say, like a Trent Williams type, who's like a
Mhm.
older tackle
Yeah.
who maybe only has like a year left, and you kind of this is the succession plan.
Mhm.
I think here this is about getting an upgrade to help Jaden Daniels, which I think to me is a pretty appropriate
Mhm.
move. The good news is that Coleman, when he came into the league, a lot of people thought he was more of a guard than tackle. Wiley played guard at Kansas City at times before he moved to tackle, and then
Mhm.
eventually came here. So those two guys can play inside. And you mentioned the Cosme spot. Yeah, they're going to need somebody. We don't know how long he'll be out, but we need presumably at least the start of the season. So I think unless Connerly just isn't ready, I would imagine he's at right tackle, and then there's some combination of Coleman, Nick Allegretti, who's the left guard, and
Mhm.
Wiley, maybe even Nate Herbig, was one of the low key free agents they signed. Some combination of those guys at left guard / right guard. Me personally, I think it would be cool if Coleman took over the left guard spot, if that's whether you see him long term, and then Allegretti replacing Cosme, and then maybe ultimately moving to being that sort of backup guard behind both, with Wiley being maybe not a swing tackle because he's not really a left tackle, but a guy
Mhm.
who's the backup tackle there. So that's kind of how I would see it. But look, if Connerly can hit sooner than later, I just think that's a huge boost. Combined with Tunsil, it's a really huge boost for that offensive line.
Now, you talked about what this could potentially mean for Brandon Coleman, and with Sam Cosmi's torn ACL, he'll probably be out to start the 2025 season. How likely is it that Coleman plays guard for Washington, and how would that transition look like? Obviously, after he played tackle as a rookie last season, this would be, I believe, his third position change already.
Yeah, I mean, I get depend. Right, it depends. Like they said, what after the Tunsil trade, Dan Quinn said he'd be moving to the right side.
Yeah.
He didn't specify guard or tackle, but it was like, okay,
Yeah.
it's going to be tackle. But obviously, they couldn't say for sure what they were going to do in
Mhm.
the draft. And now with Connerly there, my guess, I mean, they may have him compete with Connerly to a degree, but I think if they're thinking bigger picture, I would almost just say just move him to left guard. I mean, as I said, you
Mhm.
still have Wiley, so they don't want to just give Connerly the job. So from a
Yeah.
competition standpoint, you still have the guy that was the starting right tackle the last 2 years, and I just think that if they think that Coleman is ultimately going to be a guard, and with Sam Cosmi on the right side, obviously they just gave him a big extension last year. Coleman's not going to be there. So I would just say start him, put him to left guard. If Nick Allegretti beats him out, so be it. And I'm not knocking Allegretti, but we're talking like an upside situation here. Allegretti's a totally fine, solid player, but he was a guy that was a backup with Kansas City. He did some good things here to help this team, raise the floor and improve the line. But long term, Coleman would be the better bet there. So to me, that's what I would think to do with Coleman. Just cut out the middleman of the right side and just throw him over to left guard and kind of get that going.
Now, in Dane Brugler's annual NFL draft guide, and you quoted this on one of your articles recently, he said, a quick, fluid mover, Connerly has the range to reach his landmarks laterally in pass protection and on the move at the second level and in the run game. That said, what can we expect to see from Connerly in terms of on-field production this upcoming season?
It's a good question. I mean, it used to be certainly when I was closer to your age, and even in more maybe a decade or so ago, offensive linemen were the ones who felt like in the first round were the easiest projection. They were the safer guys to pick because they would come in and generally be able to play right away. But in recent years, with the way that colleges have gone to these more spread offenses, the offensive linemen don't have the same responsibilities, and a lot of them have to really learn how to pass protect in the way the NFL teams need them to do. So the transition can be a bit slow. And in this case, he's moving from the left side to the right side. That said, he started to get a little more work during this pre-draft cycle at the Senior Bowl at some other spots besides the left side. And his athleticism, I think, is what stands out. He's not a stiff mover. He's somebody that can he's got good size. He's got good athletic traits. So I think that in theory, the transition to the right side shouldn't be a huge deal. And having him get out to the second level in the run game, I think would be a big deal for this group as well. Again, Andrew Wiley's been solid the last couple of years, but he just doesn't have the same type of athletic profile as this, kid. And he's also, Connerly is 21. I mean, that's, he's very young. So there's a lot of upside and growth for a guy that's already played at a high level in college. So, I think, look, I think at the end of the day, this is all, it's not about one player, but kind of is. It's all about helping Jaden Daniels. And, he obviously is incredibly mobile and can get out of harm's way. But why, the more you can do about not putting him in harm's way goes a long way. And I think both the tackles, but I think Connerly is a nod towards that.
And you mentioned the whole protecting Jaden Daniels. I think that was their main priority going into the draft. If not, they probably would have taken an edge rusher in the first round. I know that's what you predicted in your mock draft. So I think that's kind of just the direction they were trying to go with that first pick. And looking at the defense, the Commanders also selected Ole Miss cornerback Trey Amos with the 61st pick in the draft. Amos is a press corner, possesses very good size. How do you see him matching up against other NFC East receivers such as A.J. Brown, CeeDee Lamb, Malik Neighbors? Those three players are all at least 6 feet tall and weigh 200 pounds or more. He's going to have to go up against them 2 times a year.
Yeah, it's funny. This is a good connection between the tackle and the cornerback because you like to say, what does your team need to do? What does your team need to improve and make moves in that regard? It would be naive to ignore the teams that you're going to play the most in your division. So what do these teams in the division have the most? Well, there's pass rushers, right? There's Micah Parsons, there's Brian Burns and Kayvon Thibodeau with the Giants, who now on top of that added Abdul Carter with the 3rd pick. And the Eagles just have an assortment of defensive linemen, as we know, across the board. Then we get to the secondary. You just mentioned all those receivers. I mean, I haven't done a ranking of the top receivers, but if you told me Lamb, A.J. Brown, and Neighbors were all top 10 or 12, I would be like, sure, kind of makes sense. So you've got to have better options at corner. And last year, frankly, look, Adam Peters could solve all the problems day one, but that was a group that to me looked pretty shaky going into the year, and it more or less played out that way. They were fortunate that Mikey Sanders still could, in fact, move outside. And Marshawn Lattimore, there were moments where you were like, hey, I get why they kind of made this deal, but by and large, between the injuries and the inconsistencies, that was a rough outing for him. So I think getting Amos not only gives them another guy with size, Sanderstill and Jonathan Jones, who they signed, are both 5'10" listed as. So giving them Amos, now they've got two corners backs with good size, and frankly, if Lattimore is still dealing with injuries, now they at least have more depth and a bigger guy to go to. Amos is going to be an outside corner. He's not going to be, not move inside, presumably. So they've got some options. I think the big question is this mean that Mikey Sanderson is going to move back to the slot, which is where he was originally drafted? To do that, it would seem to me to make the most sense. But we'll see. It's just like with any rookie, Amos has got to come in. Is he ready to adjust? Is he ready to, to deal with NFL receivers? Obviously, playing in the SEC, it's about as high a level as you can get without being in the pros. So he should be acclimated to big name receivers. But I think ideally he's the other outside opposite Lattimore. Sanders still goes back to the slot with Jones and Igbenogany in reserve and things like that. So that to me would be what would be interesting. And also look longer term, other than Sanders, I don't know who's going to be on this roster in 2026. Now with Amos, now you have a second guy who should be here at a minimum.
Now, you touched on this a little bit, but if Amos ends up playing across from Lattimore on the outside, that would move Sanders still into the slot. You said that's what would probably make the most sense. Would that be an improvement for Washington? And what could we expect to see from Sanders still going back to the slot where he used to play?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think Noah Igbenogany was pretty solid last year. I mean, he had not really played much in the slot, and I think he did a pretty credible job. And that was part of the reason that allowed them to keep Sanders still on the outside. But look, I mean, Sanders still has a second-round pick. He was drafted to be that slot guy. Yeah, there's a lot of versatility, but he's smart, he's tough, he's a leader. Like, there's so much to like about him, both intangibles, but also the actual play. And I mean, slot corner has become an incredibly important position. It's basically a starting spot at this point. So, look, if Lattimore could get back to anything sniffing his Pro Bowl level, and if Amos can come in and be a guy that, some people thought was worthy of being a first-round pick, and come with Sanders still, the secondary could look significantly better. And I do think that's, to me, this is like before they made the pick of Amos, to me, the important part was what do they want to do with Sanders still?
Yeah.
Similar to when they drafted when they drafted when they signed, hold on, let me start over. When they traded for Tunsil and they moved Coleman, it said, okay, they don't really view him as the left tackle. And then they make another move to get Connerly, and now they're like, okay, I don't even know if they view him as a tackle at all. And I think in Washington's case, Jonathan Jones, bringing him in, was like, okay, we have another option if we want to have a guy outside. But now Amos, that's much more of a realistic outside option. So it seems to me, to get their best guys on the field, that Sanders still goes in the slot. The only question would be that week one, it could be realistic that Jonathan Jones is the best outside cornerback, and then therefore they want to use him there. Or maybe he's in the slot with Sanders still on the outside. That would be my only wonder right off the bat. But I think longer term, Sanders still back to the slot. I just think that's, physically where he's probably just going to be best suited.
Now, kind of making our way down the draft, in the 4th round, the Commanders selected Virginia Tech wide receiver Jalen Lane. I really like this pick. He's a slot receiver, gets the ball quickly off the snap, ran a 4.34 second 40-yard dash, which ranked 4th among all wide receivers at the combine. In college, he was very effective as a punt returner as well. What can we expect to see from Lane in the return game this season for Washington now that Jamison Crowder is no longer on the roster?
Yeah, I mean, I think they want that, more explosive opportunities. I mean, look, I think Crowder and Zacchaeus last year did a fine job, all things considered, but, didn't really look at them as like those, scary home run threats. And, Lane, the reasons you just said, speed kills, and he's got that. And, you could tell I don't know if you saw the video of when they made the pick, they showed the Commanders' war room, and you could see special teams coach Larry Izzo kind of sidling up to Adam Peters and kind of gave him I like that. I like that one. Thank you for that. So, yeah, I mean, I think, look, obviously the return game is sort of an added bonus when something happens. At a minimum, don't screw up, don't fumble, don't run backwards 10 yards, but at a maximum, put yourself in position to, be able to make a play, to give your offense a boost, whatever that may be. So I think it's a big deal. And then, longer term, this offense, or for the offense, I mean, this offense needed more speed, period, especially after losing De'Ami Brown, and getting a guy with that 4.34 speed is a big deal. Again, when you also look to the longer term, as it stands, Luke McCaffrey is the only guy under contract prior to the draft. I'm at receiver. I'm assuming Terry McLaurin signs an extension, but for the purposes of the today, he hasn't. So, even if he has, you need more than just McLaurin and McCaffrey going forward. So now they have another guy in Lane who hopefully can be a starting receiver probably out of the slot down the line as well. So, I think this year he gets eased in as the returner with some opportunities on offense. And then going forward after this year, ideally he becomes one of your go-to receivers and that return threat as well.
Now, you said that he's most likely going to play in the slot, and I want to talk about that a little bit. What does that pick mean when looking at Luke McCaffrey's involvement going forward, considering that McCaffrey's also primarily a slot receiver, but really struggled to make an impact last season? 168 receiving yards, 0 touchdowns. Is Lane kind of taking McCaffrey's role in a way?
I don't think so. I mean, for one, they're kind of different types of receivers. McCaffrey's a bigger guy, more of a route running type, a good athlete. Though we saw that later in the season when he was returning some kicks, which I think will be a role he's utilized in as well. But yeah, he's got good size. He can play on the perimeter. I mean, there were so many times last year I was like, okay, here it comes. This is the Luke McCaffrey moment, the game, whatever, and it never quite happened. But it's also worth remembering, last year was only his third year playing receiver. He was a college quarterback, switched over for his last 2 years. So he is still to a degree a work in progress, but you're buying the bloodlines, the athlete, all that kind of stuff. So, do I think he's definitively going to be can he be an outside receiver every down if Lane ended up being the slot guy? I don't think that's crazy. So, I think they're different types of guys. You have different options. Again, Deebo Samuel, Noah Brown are both free agents after this year. We have no idea what happens. I would imagine if they were not to come back, you still probably have to go out and get a bigger receiver to give you what Noah Brown was giving you. And, Deebo is a very unique talent. So who knows what they could find for him. But I think I wouldn't worry about it too much for McCaffrey. But again, there's only, if these guys are the fourth and fifth guys, receivers, it's going to be hard to play them both consistently. So there's competition for snaps, but I think they're kind of different roles. In long term, I don't think it'll be an issue.
Now, the last player in the draft that I want to take a in-depth look at is 7th round Arizona running back Ja'Cory Krosky-Merritt. Both Brian Robinson and Austin Eckler's contracts expire at the end of the 2025 season. What do you think their future looks like in Washington, especially now that we're seeing the Commanders add new pieces to the backfield?
Yeah, I mean, look, with Austin Eckler, obviously he had the concussions last year. He's not old, but he's, for a running back, there's definitely some wear and tear. And that was one of the questions coming into last year. He definitely showed last year he can still play. And even after the second concussion, when he was out for a few weeks, he came back, he was effective. But, realistically, I don't know what his future is in Washington beyond this season. But okay, we'll see. Robinson is interesting, right? Because on the one hand, he's still in his rookie deal. He's still a young guy. He gives you that between the tackle power that you need. But I really thought it was a chance Washington would draft a running back earlier this year than the 7th, simply because Robinson's just not really a 3-down back. And I'm not saying that when he's in there, it completely gives away the offense, but to some degree, it kind of does. He's not really going to be the guy you're going to want to throw to as much. Now, again, Eckler is effective, but he's not a real game breaker. McNichols is solid across the board, but, not a guy you'd want to rely on. The 7th round pick, he's got a lot of shiftiness. He really does give them a different element than they have right now, but you need Robinson's, interior running to boot. So they've got 4 guys who can be maybe an effective quartet, but none of them are exactly the ideal lead. And I think ultimately that's going to be what they're going to look for, whether that's, next year in the draft or free agency or what have you. So, we'll see what Robinson does last year. Obviously, does this year. He obviously tailed off significantly the second half of last year. Not saying it was all on him, but when they needed the run game, it was MIA there for several weeks down the stretch, and I don't think that's gonna. You can't solve all your problems in a single offseason, especially with only 5 picks. But that's one I think is going to be really interesting to watch. Is how does this group play out, and do they decide ultimately to go with more all-around options than a guy who's effective running inside but limited what else he can do?
Now, one question I was going to ask you is, will Zane Gonzalez be the starter at the start of the season? But now we do know that answer. And yesterday, the Commanders signed kicker Matt Gay to a 1-year deal worth up to $5 million, including $4.35 million guaranteed. Gay made 31 of his 37 attempted field goals last year, with his only misses coming from kicks at least 50 yards out. What can we expect to see from him next season? And can you confidently say that Washington's kicking carousel is over after going through, around 4 kickers just last season?
I don't think I can confidently say that just because we saw out last year. I mean, last year 4 kickers didn't even include Brandon McManus, who was the equivalent of Gay, and then obviously he had some off the field issues, and they moved on from him. Look, when Gay signed with the Colts 2 years prior, they gave him the highest deal I believe ever for a kicker because he was coming off 2 really impressive seasons with the Rams. I mean, he did not sustain that same level, but he was hardly terrible. You mentioned, the kicks he missed were from outside of 50. In this era, you got to be able to make kicks from outside 50, but at a minimum, don't miss anything inside. And he did that very well. There really just weren't many options out there to pick. I think here's my read of this, Matthew. I think we know that they had some private workouts and did some real homework on the kickers in this draft. And the fact that they didn't sign Gay before the draft says to me they were open to drafting a kicker if things had gone a certain way. I don't know, I mean, in the 6th round, I know the kicker from Miami went. In the 7th round, I believe the Florida State kicker went. It's fine that they didn't get those guys, but I think they were interested. And therefore, once the draft is over, they signed Gay. Whereas, on the flip side, they signed Josh Johnson as a 3rd quarterback before the draft, rather than assuming that they might draft one, because I assume they realized we're not going to do that. So they just got ahead of the curve on that one. So I think they were open to drafting a kicker, but my understanding is the Colts basically moved on from Gay because they like the upside with the guy they currently have more, so they went with that. But he's solid, making everything inside of 50. Good start. Now be more consistent deep, and Washington may really have something here.
And I don't obviously love that he was 3 of 9 from beyond 50, but you have to consider with the kickers that Washington had last year, going 31 of 31 inside 50 would not have been a reality or even close to that. So I think when you have that consistency, it's obviously a good start. And the Commanders have already made multiple undrafted free agent signings following the NFL draft, including safety Trey Rucker, offensive lineman Tim McKay, and defensive tackle Ricky Barber, just to name a few. That said, which undrafted free agent do you see getting the biggest role or making the largest impact in 2025?
Oh boy. Yeah. I mean, last year they had two undrafted free agents make the team, and Tyler Owens and Colson Yankoff.
Yep.
And, a lot of times it comes down to just what's the position that has room. One thing that's interesting about the Commanders this year, now that they made the moves that they made, like offensive line and cornerback were 2 areas and linebacker, frankly, were the areas where I thought there's an actual roster opening, like based on where they were a year ago and the number of guys you'd want to keep and guys who I think would make the team. There were openings. They obviously got filled with the draft. So I don't know that there's a position, honestly, right now that I'm like, there's a clear opening. I mean, somebody can come in and play well, or they can, we didn't know they were going to trade Jahan Dotson last year, and they did. I think I need to, we don't know officially who their list is because they just haven't announced it yet. And the UDFA market is very weird. It's the wild, wild west. Until guys sign and show up, you never know for sure. Crap, I'm blanking on the guy's name. The receiver from Louisville, Ja'Cory, what's his last name? You must have that. I'll look it up. That's okay. Well, this is the guy that I kind of keep focusing on because I'm wondering about Washington's sixth receiver if we're going to play that
Ja'Cory
game.
was it
Go
Ja'Cory Brooks?
Ja'Cory Brooks. Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was an Alabama transfer. Went to Louisville. He's one of these guys that's kind of got like a freaky size and ability to track the ball. Had 61 catches last year. The thing is, like, I'm looking at the receiver room, and if they keep six, which is a usual number for teams, McLaurin, Debo, Samuel, Noah Brown, Jalen Lane, Luke McCaffrey. Of those five, only McCaffrey and Lane are going to play special teams. And typically, you're going to want to have at least half the room do that. Michael Gallup, who you would probably say is the sixth guy, never plays special teams. So I don't know. Is it realistic that they're going to keep four receivers who don't play special teams? So I'm not saying Ja'Cory Brooks is a stalwart. I'm just saying if he can, and with some of the upside that he may have, that could be an interesting guy to keep an eye on. At a minimum, I think he'll be a summer crush for a lot of people because everybody always loves the receivers who make plays down the field, and that happens every single year in camp.
Now, it's obvious that Washington could use a little help at defensive edge. They didn't target one in the draft. They haven't signed a defensive edge, undrafted free agent. Some of the best free agents that they still could get to fill that role include Zadarius Smith, Von Miller, Matthew Judon. However, would signing any of those players really even make sense considering that it wouldn't add any youth to the position? And I think those guys and a few other potential targets are starting to hit a decline in progression due to age.
Yeah, I like where your head's at with this one. Like, I feel like we have reached a point where talking about adding defensive ends probably doesn't make too much sense anymore. I mean,
Mhm.
if you're just talking pass rushers, Darius Smith had 9.5 sacks last year. Nobody
Mhm.
else on this team right now had more than 5 a year ago. If you said to me, "Hey, we're going to bring him in," that I could buy that. But beyond that, he's going to be 33. Most of the guys you talked about are definitely on the wrong side of 30 as it relates to playing professional football. And whether or not they give you a little bit more boost in the pass rush is not it's not enough to say, hey, we have to go sign one of these guys. Clearly, they needed to do a better job against the run last year. They were ranked 30th. Getting a guy like Dietrich Wise, I think, is a step towards that.
Yeah.
Getting Javon Kinlaw while a defensive tackle, it's clear they're going to use him some on the edge to help set the edge and help out there. So, if you're going to play those guys there plus Dorrance Armstrong, I'm not, obviously you have a rotation of guys, but I don't. It's one thing if they had drafted some kid to give you that burst of youth and athleticism, but it's another thing for it to be one of these older guys. So I don't see it. I mean, if they did, I wouldn't think that would be terrible. At this point, I don't see it. They've got 11 defensive linemen, including tackles,
Mhm.
that I think could justifiably make this team. Are they going to keep 11? I don't know. 10 might be the number, but they have bodies. Now, injuries will happen, so I get that. So you always need more, but I don't think the guys that are available of the names we know. Is there some
Mhm.
sneaky reserve who barely played for another team that they like? Maybe, but in terms of the guys that we know, I don't know that I see any of them really making a huge difference at this point.
I mean, Zadarius Smith, Preston Smith, and Matthew Judon are all 32, and then Von Miller is 36. I think it's just a situation. You see how Armstrong and Farrell do this season. Realistically, not much changes from last season. Then maybe you look at drafting a player in the draft, but I just don't see going after an older guy as an option that really helps in the short term or long term, to be honest. And besides a potential edge rusher, are there any other available free agents or positions that you would like to see Washington target prior to the start of the season?
I don't think there's anything that they really have to do. I mean, that was one of the things about it's a lot of reasons that made this figuring out their draft complicated. They're picking 29th,
Mhm.
but also they kind of didn't need anything. I mean, they could argue they could get upgrades everywhere except for quarterback. But at the same time, they were okay with what they have. So I don't know that I think there's anything they really have to do. Um,
Mhm.
yeah, I really don't. I mean, like
Yeah.
I said, I kind of went through the 53 projection yesterday, and I ended up, I think, with like 56 guys. I was like, yeah, this can all make sense. And then it just comes down to what position you want to keep more of.
Mhm.
And that's not factoring in, obviously, some rando UDFA or something like that. So they look, if there's guys out there they think they can help them make the team, whatever, go ahead and do it. More competition, all the better. But I don't think there's any spot where I'm like, wow, they are really thin there. They've got to get more help going into this.
Now, I do have one final question to ask before we wrap things up. If there was one piece of advice you could give to an aspiring sports broadcaster and journalist like me, what would it be?
Um, you know, if this is what you want to do, if a career in sports in some way is something you want to do, give it all you have, and do it with a lot of passion, and look, I can tell just by talking to you here, like, you take this seriously. This isn't just you're not talking about like your fantasy football team, or like making kind of jokes about, or like you're not gushing like a fan. You're asking
Yeah.
me questions that I would ask, or other reporters would ask, and I think that's important. I mean, it's frustrating at times, because I think a lot of people, I think, believe that anybody can kind of do a lot of this job because it's
Mhm.
sports. And if you talk about sports, you watch a game, you got a 50-50 chance of being right about who's going to win. And people have opinions, you can throw those out there, but to me, the ones that are interesting, the ones that matter, the ones I want to listen to, are the ones that take it seriously. I mean, it's a game, but I mean, if this is the thing you're going to do, just like any other profession, be serious about it. Don't just be flippant. Don't just get emotional about the way fans were going to do. And I like I said, if you want to go do it, look, I could sit here and encourage you to not, because it's a tough business. But hey, if you want to do it, just go for it, and really put your heart and soul into it. And I think you can get there. You're already clearly off to a pretty good start. So yeah, for you in particular, if that's something you want to pursue, just go all in, to jump all in.
Yeah, I really appreciate that advice and the kind words. I can't thank you enough for coming on. Is there anything else you want to say to the people watching before we wrap things up? Where can they find some of your work?
Sure. I can find the written work on The Athletic. I have a podcast, Last Man Standig. And yeah, I mean, look, I really appreciate it. You're doing a great job. This is a very fun interview. And if you're the representation of what's to come in this industry, I'm looking forward to it.
Again, I really appreciate that. Big thanks to Ben Standig for being the 66th ever Highlight Haven interview guest. And as always, we will see you next time.